In the previous video, we removed the gearbox. And now we continue with playing some drums and work a little bit, clean a little bit. We mount a brand new flywheel, we torque a little bit, mount a new clutch, again torque a little bit. My favorite part, mount the gearbox back again, and we change the bearings on the entire car. Welcome to part 2, where we are going to continue where we stopped last time, and that is by removing the old clutch and the flywheel. The clutch and the flywheel have all those 300,000 kilometers that the car currently has. I suspect the clutch isn't damaged, but the flywheel is. Not because of the mileage, but because the previous owner didn't behave to the car very nice, most possibly, as we saw in the previous gearbox axle crack example. So the flywheel is just banging when the engine is cold and it needs to be changed. Yeah, it's been a hard day's night. I could play a song using that flywheel. Well, I think one example speaks for everything, so here you have it. Common issue with these dual mass flywheels when you don't treat the car very well. Where did our German technicians make a mistake, huh? Of course, nein! We never! Well, nobody's perfect. So before removing the flywheel, you have to block it so it doesn't turn, because these bolts are so tight that you would turn the whole engine over. In the repair manual there's a specific tool, but you can just use some tools around that will block the wheel from turning, and that's gonna do the job. And then you can remove the bolts for the flywheel and take the flywheel out. Surprisingly, the clutch pressure plate and the clutch disc were not really in a bad condition after 300,000 kilometers, which is quite nice surprise. Unfortunately, because the flywheel was in a bad condition, and buying the whole set is always better than buying those parts separately, so I took the whole set with the clutch. We're gonna replace it anyway. Okay, so here comes the last bolt for the flywheel. Still be careful with it in case you're gonna do it. I mean, it's not that heavy as the gearbox, but it still sure is heavy, so it doesn't fall on your head. So in case, better just hold it with one hand, because you really don't want this thing landing on you. The metal plate can be also taken out. I think when doing this job it's worth considering cleaning it. You can actually notice that in the manual gearbox version there is no pilot bearing in the crankshaft. This only goes when you have a DSG transmission. So in this case we don't need to replace it because there is none in there. It's a part that costs about 2 to 3 euros, so in case it goes wrong you don't want to disassemble the whole gearbox, engine, and everything just because of a part for cost like that. But in our case, because there is a manual transmission, we don't need to worry about it. So the whole new set comes with a new flywheel and a clutch, bolts, and also a brand new clutch release bearing. This is how it looks. I decided to go for the Sachs version, although the old clutch that you saw was from Luke manufacturer. These are the two versions that go with these engines. They are stock parts, and it is more worth buying the whole set than buying these parts apart, because then of course the price is higher. Here we also have a nice comparison of the two sets, the old one on the right and the new one on the left. You can also see that they are a bit different. If the flywheel is banging like shown and can turn each side about, let's say, 10 feet of the wheel, then of course the flywheel is just destroyed. The new flywheel, as you can see, doesn't bang at all, absolutely silent and firm. It can't move sideways and turns only very slightly when you try to turn it with force. So that's the clear and visual difference. This is the old clutch. Well, the finding is, after 300,000 kilometers, not really in a bad shape. I mean, these bullet points at the pressure plate were because of this bang of the flywheel, but the clutch disc isn't bad at all, actually. Nevertheless, we have a new clutch, so we're not going to use this old one, and we cannot combine it with Sachs anyway, because this is a different brand. They just don't fit together. Okay, so it's time to start with some cleaning, because we're going to reassemble everything backwards for now. So we need to clean this metal plate that belongs under the flywheel. For this I simply use something that's designed for very dirty engine cleaning, because it takes off the carbon and all the debris immediately. Here's the before and after. It's a clear difference. And now, because the plate was a little bit bent, so we're gonna have to straighten it out with a hammer, possibly, and then we can start mounting back everything backwards. So the plate is installed, flywheel coming in. Watch out again, it's heavy. Some bolts are closer to each other, as you can see, so there's only one way you can mount it, so be careful for that. Obviously all the bolts have to fit, and here you really want to use a torque wrench, because you don't want to mess it up. So you need to tighten it good enough, all bolts hard enough, and all to spec. You mustn't break any bolt. And before we get to the torques, then you want to make sure that you always go in a star pattern. You really don't want this thing wobbling on your crankshaft, so you have to make sure that you tighten the flywheel evenly. So you start at the top, then you go bottom, then you go across, and then the last one, and go like this until you tighten all bolts. Once they get a little bit tighter, then you have to use a torque wrench, and this, according to spec, according to repair manual, the torque is 60 Newton meters first, and then you go a 90-degree angle with each and every bolt on the flywheel. While doing the angle, you can use a marker on the bolts. It's easiest to see. It's not visible in the video, but then it's a way that you know exactly how much you have turned the bolt and how much you still need to meet the repair manual. Having all bolts torqued in a star pattern to spec, the clutch plate comes in. While we install the clutch disc, then make sure that you place it in a way that it can easily turn on the flywheel. You will feel it when you put it on. Basically what it means that the side at which it says Getriebeseite has to be pointing towards the transmission, towards the gearbox. Of course, important to mention that both the flywheel surface and the pressure plate surface have to be super cleaned with a brake cleaner before installing. You don't want any mess on the clutch disc. It might reflect how long your clutch is going to last, so this is highly recommended. So in comes the new clutch. It's important to position it well, so that the holes for the bolts on the pressure plate match exactly the holes for the bolts on the flywheel. There are 6 bolts for the clutch, and of course another important part, you will need to center the clutch exactly with the gearbox axle, so you need a clutch center tool. For example, I'm using this plastic alignment tool, very simple one, doesn't cost a lot, very highly recommended. Otherwise, once again, if you want your clutch to last for a long time, make sure you center it right. If you get M6 bolts, the torque is 30 Newton meters. For M7 bolts is 20 Newton meters. When all bolts are torqued and the clutch plate centered, it's time to install the clutch bearing to the gearbox. So we take off the old one and install the new one. There are 3 bolts. Okay, given that I'm changing the whole clutch and flywheel, I will also change the clutch master cylinder, since the one that has been there is not the original one. The bottom one is the old one and the top one is the new one. The cylinder should come with this chip, which is connected electronically to the car. Here the new one is already equipped with it, so we won't need to change it, but anyway it's possible to disassemble it. This is the hose that comes from the brake fluid reservoir with its seal. First install the seal and then install the hose. You hear a click and that's it. So we open up all the clips and get the master cylinder ready for install. This is where the master cylinder lives in the car, right behind the clutch pedal. And also connect the hose to the brake fluid reservoir. And that's it. Connect the bottom hydraulics going towards the gearbox, and we can mount the gearbox. To mount the master cylinder, it needs to come in, turn a little bit to the left, then you push it in, and then you turn it to the right. It should click and stay in place without any possible movement. You can see that there is a perfectly centered clutch disc, and that's the way it should be. Rather spend more time centering the clutch out than having issues later on. This is my favorite part. The gearbox coming back in. I really recommend that you put the gearbox in the neutral position before it comes back in. Otherwise you might have a little bit of a challenge with inserting the input shaft into the clutch disc. Because if the gearbox is engaged in a gear, then it's really difficult to turn. So in the neutral you will have a possibility of turning. So once you're gonna get it up there and wobble a little bit around, then you have a slighter chance of hitting the clutch disc and inserting it in correctly. Of course, if you want to go for a challenge, you can actually choose between 1 and 6, because where in the first gear you have the lighter challenge, and in the 6th gear you have the hardest challenge. But it's also a way to go, but it's up to you. I chose to get the neutral. Don't forget that the flange on the other side of the gearbox is out, otherwise you wouldn't be able to get it in, because we took it out before we took out the gearbox. And if you turn the gearbox too much to that side, she really likes to squirt some oil from there. So be careful with that, because the gearbox is really heavy and it's limited space and it's hard to manipulate at these 1 meter squared or whatever you have in there. So make sure you don't, in case you need, that you don't hold the gearbox listed to that side for too long, because you're gonna lose oil and you're gonna smell oil for a while. And now everything goes backwards just the way it was disassembled. For more details, you can watch the previous video as the gearbox was removed. Now we are going to continue with the next preparations. So we connect back the clutch hydraulics with the vent to the clutch bearing. You just click it on and close the clip. The purpose of the vent is to make sure that you can get all air from the system out. Afterwards, the hydraulics is all tight and complete. So we take the cap off, we fill in the brake fluid reservoir so that the brake fluid gets to the master cylinder, and we start pumping the clutch. To avoid any mess around, I use a hose which I put on the vent, and this measuring cup which will collect any brake fluid that's going to come out from the vent. When doing so, please respect gravity. When there is pure air in the hydraulics, all you need to do is fill up the reservoir of brake fluid, because the fluid is heavier than air. It's going to push out the air automatically when you open the vent. You can see already some bubbles and some brake fluid coming out from the vent through the hose. And you just have to wait until you're gonna see pure brake fluid coming out, and then it will be time to harden the clutch pedal. Make sure that you always have enough fluid in the brake fluid reservoir, because you don't want to run out of fluid, because air would start getting back into the system again, and you don't want that. And once you see brake fluid, then you start pushing the clutch pedal to get out any additional air which might be still in the system. You have to continue doing that until the clutch pedal will be hard when you close the vent, and it will return all the way back up where it should be. Okay, we lift the engine with the gearbox a little bit back up, because previously we lifted it back down using the bottom jack a little bit in order so that it's easier for us to get it out. That way we can prepare the right engine mount for the gearbox bolts, and we can connect the gearbox to the shifter. Before proceeding, make sure that every part that comes back is clean, rusty bolts cleaned with WD-40, and parts with some kind of engine cleaner so they are clean also. And everything comes back together. And it's definitely good to remember where you put your bolts. Yeah, of course, on the table. You definitely want to balance the unit on the bolts before you put in the bolts. It's on the bottom jack, and lift it on the wooden pole for the carbines. Put back and tighten the bolts for the bottom transmission cylinder block. Remove the carbines and the wooden pole as engine support. The bottom jack can be also removed because now the gearbox is mounted to the right engine mount. In order to connect the gearbox with the shifter, we need to fix the gearbox in a neutral position with this small lever here, like so. And then you have to go inside the car and remove the shifter cover, and also fix the shifter using a screwdriver or a small lever or tool, whatever. Now we can attach the Bowdens, and this is what you need to do with both Bowdens before you put them on. You have to put the spring in this position by turning the plastic wheel on the Bowden. The way you can release it and take it out. And also when you put it on, then it's the same process. So you put it on and then you release the spring. Make sure that you've previously already attached the console to the bolt to the left and bolt it. And if you have both the gearbox lever and the shifter fixed with a lever in a position, then now you just got your gearbox aligned with the shifter. That's the way to do it. And then you can release the Bowden springs and the Bowdens are attached. So we release the gearbox fixed lever, Then we release the shifter, fix lever, and that's done. The shifter should go very smoothly. If it does, everything's fine. With the new parts, I have also received a new starter. I decided to replace it because the old one sometimes had difficulty starting the car. After receiving the new part, I actually found out that instead of 2 kilowatts, it has 1.7 kilowatts. The sheet with test results was present and the test seemed successful. So although it wasn't exactly an OEM part, I decided to use it. And so the starter is coming in. There are 2 long bolts and these get 50 Newton meters. Then we connect the cables. Basically everything comes in just the way we took it out. And the last one on the starter, and there's a 13mm socket on this one. The starter is new, so I'm expecting it to work absolutely perfectly. We will see on the test results afterwards. One more bolt for the gearbox. And we also install the flange so we can put in the drive shaft. To install the flange, you actually have to press it all the way in before the bolt can actually bite into the thread. And once it bites in, then you can tighten it. While tightening the flange, it is a good idea to use the help of a lever because the flange will turn with the force of the torque wrench. Otherwise, that's done. Now we can assemble the battery back to the car. Be careful about the cables to the right so you don't damage them when putting in the rack. To tighten the battery, we install the clip. And the battery cover. And then we can install the cables, the plus and minus, and tighten the bolts so they stay in place. That's it. Now the filter box can come in. So first we install the small housing and then the whole filter box. Be careful about some hoses down there below that you have to swing the filter box around, because if you pull them too much you might damage the flange and the cooling system to the right of the engine. And if you do so, you'll have to replace it, and it's not really a nice job. Trust me, I went through it. So we also put back the clip with nice clippers designed for that. We connect the air mass sensor and the vacuum hose. And that's it. We have a last bolt to install, so we put it in, and now we're ready to do the first test. I've double checked that I put everything back in order, so now we can start the car on the jack stands and test the new clutch and the new starter. Seems pretty good. I think we're set. This is looking absolutely perfect. No weird noises, nothing, just a clean engine sound, and the gears are turning, so that's a great result. Alright, we also want to change the bearings, so before putting the drive shafts in, we're going to take off the brake rotor, and we're going to take out the bearings. So first we take all the bolts out, and then we can start removing the brake flaps first. When you take out all these parts, make sure that they're not just hanging down freely from the top to the bottom. Always place them someplace, because you don't want to damage the cables, the lines, or anything that is used there. I'm mainly talking about the brake caliper because it's a bit more heavy. So the second part of the brake caliper is coming down. Now the brake rotor. Because the bolts for the bearings are torqued pretty tight, it's a good idea to attach the arm of the car, because it's going to hold the whole assembly in place. And that way we can use force to free the bolts that hold the bearing. On the front there are 4 bolts, and they are long and tight. I'm always excited when I see long and tight bolts. Alright, how do I get you out? That won't work. Nope, still in place. Alright, this time they're coming. Alright, let's take another try on the second side. Well, the first is done, obviously, but this way you can see the bolts right in the view. So caps off the brake caliper, goes very fast, arm goes in, bolts go out, small ones, big ones, caliper down. Brake rotor down, and these are the 4 bolts that hold the bearing. If the drive shaft was in, then you wouldn't be able to do this, because it's just too big for inserting a socket into these bolts. So definitely you want to do it without the drive shaft. So some WD-40, the bolts have been there for 300,000 kilometers, I guess 11 years or 12, whatever. Some long time. And I'm not gonna use a torque wrench all the way this time. So the bolts are out. Now how does the bearing go out? we use a bolt, and it's going to do the job for us. Why do things the hard way if they can be done simply, right? And we torque, and the bearing is coming out. Always useful to have some tricks, especially when playing with forces. The hub of the bearing, of course, was a bit corroded. Found some rust in there also on the bearing, that's why it didn't go out so smoothly. So we used some WD-40, cleaned the hub. The bearing wasn't really bad, but it was noisy already. I think you can hear that. But after 300,000 kilometers, not really bad. And here comes the new one, nice and shiny. So the new bearing comes in. I put in 2 bolts and I put them in an X pattern because you want to insert both sides of the bearing into the hub equally, and then slowly bolt these bolts in an X pattern to get the bearing pushed into the hub. And now it's possible to start tightening the bolts. You can see that the bearing sits really nicely and tight on the hub now, so we can torque these bolts. And it's a bearing, so make sure that you torque these bolts to spec. Once you've done that, you put back the brake rotor. Boy, that bearing is silent. It's a good idea to clean the brake rotor with a brake cleaner. Assemble back the brake caliper with all the bolts. And these are the brakes, so recommend to give them the recommended torques. And once this is done, that's it. Before assembling the drive shafts, I decided to do a little service on them. To do this, it's clever to attach the drive shaft to the gearbox and block it with a small lever, because to take off the joint you will need some force. And while applying the force, you don't want the joint to be turning. You can use a bearing puller for this, for example. The lubricant was sometimes a little bit escaping and creating mess around. So we're going to replace the cuff, put there an OEM part, and make sure that it's tightened properly. So we take off the old cuff and replace it with the new one. First of all, it's important to clean all the surfaces thoroughly. The grease needs to come out completely. Ideally use a degreaser to achieve best results. The procedure is very simple. After cleaning the shaft, the new cuff comes in until you hear a nice click. Then we have to clean carefully the surface of the joint where the cuff will be clipped. Once again, a good degreaser is recommended. Once the cuff is clipped to the joint, you don't want it to move in any way. So we clean it properly. We give the joint a little bit of some new grease, but only on the inner side. Make sure it doesn't get to the outer side. And then insert the joint onto the shaft. To attach the joint onto the shaft, you just use a hammer, and don't forget ever to use a large socket, because if you would bang into the joint, you would basically damage the edges of the joint and you wouldn't be able to insert it into the bearing. So always use a socket. When the joint is holding well, It's time to install the clips. Once again, clean the surfaces a little bit. To install the clip, you can help yourself with a screwdriver. You really want to get them as tight as possible before tightening with the pliers. The small bottom one is relatively simple because we click the cuff in position there. But the top is a little bit of a challenge because there you have the moving joint. So it has to be aligned and clipped evenly through the whole joint. So we insert the clip first and then make sure that the clip and the cuff is even on the joint before clipping and tightening with the pliers. And that's it. That's the drive shaft done. To install the left drive shaft, the small one, there are 6 bolts and 3 pads coming with it. We make sure they are clean before coming in, and in goes the drive shaft with the bolts. And pads attached. The bolts are long, so install them first and then you can torque them. So the joint goes into the bearing. Sometimes you just need to play around with it a little bit. But if you haven't damaged the edges, it will go in without any issue. And we can also install and torque the drive shaft bolt. You torque the bolt on the flange with the help of a screwdriver in the brake rotor. Clean the brake rotor a bit. Install the arm, and that's it. On the right side of the car there are also 6 bolts for drive shaft and 3 pads, but there's also a heat shield coming in. So there's an additional install of the heat shield. We install the arm and that's the job done. We also have a new V-belt, so we are going to install it and replace the 10-year-old one. That's the belt on the alternator and the climatization compressor. So just use the wrench and move the pulley and free the pulley a little bit and the belt can come off. The installation procedure is in the same way. I just recommend to start inserting the belt from the top side from the alternator. It has to sit perfectly on all the wheels, and that's done. Before putting in the wheel covers, it's a good idea to check whether there's some dirt in these places, because this is where cars love to rust. So it's definitely a good idea to keep these places clean or even paint them with some strong anti-corrosive paint, because dirt likes to assemble here over time. So just brush it a little bit and that's better. So the wheel cover can come in. And we install all the bolts, both sides, and that's done. After both sides are installed, the bottom cover can come in. now we can assemble the wheels. Before that, some final brake cleaning. Both sides, stroke the bolts, and that's done. Car can come down on the ground. Jack stands coming out. Final torque, and that's it. Okay, since the front is done, now we can do the back bearings. So the caps off, wheels down. Here the brake calipers are a bit different. You need two wrenches, one 13mm and one 15mm, and use the 15mm to release the bolt, while the 13mm is just holding the bolt in place on the other side. Do that twice and the brake caliper is coming off. We also release the second part from the hub, holding the brake pads. The brake rotor can come down. Use a pry bar and bang it to get the cap off. Some WD-40. This bolt has been there for 12 years and is torque tight because it's the only bolt basically holding the wheel. So to release it, we're going to need a pretty big set because just one pry bar won't be enough. So that's the first pry bar coming in and the second. Let's see if this lever works. Yeah, right. It took me some time, but it definitely works. You just need a little bit more force than just with one pry bar. And once the bolt is a little bit free, use the help of a gun to release the bolt, because the bolt once again is too long. And this bearing comes out really easily. Look at that. It looks like it's falling apart to me. Oh, it's not. It's just wobbling a little bit. Oh, one part of it. The new one, of course, is much more firm, and that's the way it should be. Before installing, of course, we clean everything. So WD-40 for the rust and a little bit of a dirt. And some fogging oil just for preservation. So bearing comes in. Sits nicely. And now the bolt. As I already said, this is the only bolt holding the whole wheel on the back. So you really want to torque this one to spec. So first it gets 180 Newton meters, and once you've done that, then you need a 180-degree turn. it's best to use a marker for that. The bolt is big, so there's plenty space to mark on. So mark at the bottom, the line needs to be facing upwards. And that's it. One bearing at the back is done. Exactly pointing to the top. Now we install the cap. And everything goes back as it came out. So the brake rotor, it's so silent. Clean it a little bit. I also decided to add some fogging oil on the wheels, because this place sometimes likes to rust. Brake pads and caliper coming in. Again, it's the brakes, torque them to spec. Now the wheel. Jack out on the ground, torque the wheel, and that's one side done. And now the same thing on the other side. We also have a pair of new wipers, so install them. It's very easy. You just push a button, take one out, and click one in. Same procedure both sides. And now everything is done, and it's finally time to test the car. We have a new flywheel, new clutch, new starter, and the bearings. Although the bearings will be tested on longer trips, I suspect that the car will be very silent since the bearings are original parts, since I decided to use the FAG brand. So let's see how it performs. Cold engine, absolutely no banging. We basically have a clean engine sound, which is great. I haven't heard that since I bought the car. The starter works perfectly. The sound is a bit different, but it's nice actually. I like it, although it's not OEM. We'll keep it there. And the clutch also engages very nicely. The hydraulics is good. The pull is good. It's not vibrating. It's really firm, nice and steady. The sound is absolutely clean. Pure engine sound, no knocks, no extra vibrations, no banging, just a beautiful clean engine sound. That's it for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.